Hello everyone. Tonight, we will go back to 27 BC to see the formation and development of the Roman Empire. One of the greatest and most influential civilizations in world history. The event that marked this turning point was when the Roman Senate gave Octavian the title of Augustus, a title that meant respect and supreme authority. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. You open your eyes to a misty morning on the banks of the Tiber as the first rays of sunlight touch the distant hills. Everything around you is primitive. Hand-built huts, the barking of dogs mixed with the bleating of goats. And in the distance, a group of men chiseling stone from the slopes of the Palatine Hill. This is Rome. But not the Rome you imagined. No grand marble buildings. Just a small, poor village, soon to be the center of a great empire. The story of the Roman Empire does not begin with war or politics. It begins with a legend. You are sitting by a fire in the night, next to a storyteller with a long beard and fiery eyes. He tells of two twin brothers, Romulus and Remus, who were abandoned by the Tiber River and raised by a she-wolf. When they grew up, they decided to build a new city. But as in all iconic myths, conflict breaks out. Romulus kills Remus and names the city after himself, Rome. A story steeped in mythic imagery retold thousands of times over the centuries. Believe it or not, it is the original spirit of the Roman people, brave, brutal, but idealistic. But let's leave the myth behind and return to archaeological reality. Rome around the 8th century BC was a small settlement, sandwiched between larger civilizations like the Etruscans to the north and the Greeks to the south. Its people were farmers, craftsmen, warriors, and all living with the harshness of nature. You walk through a primitive marketplace, no roof. It's just makeshift cloths stretched on wooden poles, where people trade wild game, crude pottery, and salt. Everything is handmade, but life is orderly. There were rules, there were leaders, and there was pride. From early on, the Romans saw themselves as different. It's not richer, not more numerous, but more ... stubborn. They developed a family system called the paterfamilias, where the father was the absolute center of power. You wouldn't want to disobey him. He could sell you into slavery if he wanted to. But it was also how Romans learned discipline and responsibility from a young age. Gradually, Rome began to connect with neighboring settlements, forming defensive alliances and expanding its influence. They learned building techniques from the Etruscans, learned writing from the Greeks, but developed a very distinct way of life. By 600 BC, Rome was no longer a village. It had a king, a council, and laws. But the Roman king was not a divine being like the Egyptian pharaoh, but a mortal replaceable. And this soon became the key to the formation of Roman identity. No one could be supreme forever. A final king, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, or Tarquinius the Arrogant, did the wrong thing. He ruled as a tyrant, oppressed his people, and was eventually overthrown in 509 BC. The Romans revolted not just to get rid of their king, but to say something. We don't need another king. You could hear the cheers from the hills as the Roman Republic was born. From here, the Romans began to write down their laws, elected 2 consuls each year to avoid the accumulation of power, and established a parliamentary system to represent the nobility. Of course, the common people were still largely excluded, but things were just getting started. In the dim light of the evening, you sit on the banks of the Tiber River, watching small boats carrying wine, olive oil, and wheat arrive. No one knows that from this humble land an empire will rise, dominating Europe, North Africa, and much of the Middle East. But you can feel it coming. There is something in the faces of the Roman people, a simmering confidence, a fierce belief in order and law, and a remarkable ability to learn from failure. The Roman Empire does not yet exist, but you can see the first seeds of it in the people, the rules, and even in the way they tell the story of a wolf and 2 lost children. You're standing in the central square of the young city of Rome. As the citizens gather around a large inscribed stone, the 12 tables have just been erected. It's a pivotal moment. For the first time in the city's history, the laws are no longer handed down orally by the nobles, but written down so that ordinary people can understand them and at least know when they're about to be punished. It's not that the Romans suddenly love clarity. They were forced to change. After the overthrow of Tarquinius, Rome didn't descend into chaos, but quickly established a republic. Instead of having a king who ruled for life, the Romans elected 2 consuls each year. These men would rule for 12 months, then step aside. A clever way to combat tyranny, though. You'll see people trying to break that rule later. There was a big problem, though. The system was largely for the patricians. They sat in the Senate, they held office, and they said, "This is for the people." But the bulk of Rome was made up of plebeians, peasants, craftsmen, soldiers who were taxed, drafted, but had no say. You can imagine a peasant being arrested for not paying his debts, even though he had just returned from battle. "The law is the law," the patricians said. "But what law?" the peasant asked. No one would let him read it. The pressure grew, and eventually the plebeians protested by withdrawing from the city. That's right, they organized a secessio plebis, leaving Rome empty. No peasants, no soldiers, no craftsmen, no one to run the city. This was a political shock, and to appease it, the patricians were forced to make concessions. The law of the 12 tables was born from this, engraved on bronze, placed in a public place for all citizens to read. One of the provisions was quite direct. If a debtor fails to pay, the creditor may bind him for 60 days. Yes, clear, but not gentle. Still, this was the beginning of a legal society. The Romans were so serious about the law that they had a class of professional lawyers and judges very early on. You pass a trial on a market corner, no courtroom or robes, but still full of arguments, even shouting and a little bit of salt. Here you see the Roman spirit. Tough, well-argued, and ready to protest if they see something wrong. Gradually, the common people gained more power. They had their own representatives, people who could veto decisions of the Senate, and no one could touch them while they were on duty. A kind of political armor that many later used to advance themselves. You will hear the names of some families emerging: Brutus, Fabi, Corneli, names that would later echo throughout Europe. But at that time, they were just ambitious men building power in a system that was still in its infancy, while Rome was gradually perfecting itself internally outside. The land of Italy was still full of other tribes that had not yet been subdued. The Romans realized one thing: to survive, they could not only talk morality, but also take up swords. Wars began with neighboring tribes such as the Volsci, Aqui, and especially the Samnites. These wars were not only bloody, but also lasted for decades. But each time they ended, Rome not only took land, but also invited the loser to become an ally. "You can keep the territory. Just send us troops when needed." A flexible and extremely effective strategy, so much so that you could call it Roman diplomacy. Rome gradually became the major political military center of the Italian peninsula. This was no accident. The Romans were masters of organization. They carved straight roads through rugged terrain, set up military camps with precise layouts. And most importantly, they were good at digging wells. Oh, and don't overlook the need to keep your soldiers drinking clean water. However, a new problem arose. Who got the spoils? Who got to decide how to divide the land? Each victory was a new test for the Republic, and each time, the rift between the nobility and the commoners became more evident. A young soldier stood looking at a map, pointed to a new piece of land, and asked, "Can I have a piece of this?" The senator replied, "If you can write Latin and have the right family name." Yet Rome continued to expand, to triumph. The Roman Republic, with all its confusion, contradictions, and inequalities, was creating something unprecedented. A civil state with laws, checks on power, and boundless ambition. You sit on a stone step, watching the sun set over the red-tiled roofs. Despite all the injustices, there is something alive about Rome. A sense that things are not yet perfect, but are moving toward a future full of possibilities and dangers. You wake up to a crisp morning on a hilltop overlooking the Mediterranean, where the Roman army has set up camp. It's around 264 BC, and the smell of bread baking from the soldiers' clay ovens mixes with the smell of coal smoke and the clang of steel. A centurion is scolding his young soldiers for breaking their shovels, and you're trying to figure out why the Romans are in Sicily. The answer: Carthage. They weren't from Italy. The Carthaginians were Phoenician immigrants from what is now Tunisia. A wealthy, seafaring people, they ran a trading empire that stretched across North Africa, the Mediterranean islands, and even as far as Spain. And like all powerful neighbors, Rome and Carthage couldn't avoid clashing. Their first war, the First Punic War, began as a minor incident in Sicily and quickly spiraled into a 23-year-long disaster. The problem is, Rome never had a navy. You read that right. The empire that would eventually rule the seas didn't even have a decent fleet to begin with. But instead of giving up, they picked up a wrecked Carthaginian ship, copied its design, and built hundreds of them. They even added mobile battle bridges so they could turn naval warfare into land warfare, which they were better at. That's very Roman. We're not good, but we're stubborn. In the end, they won. Carthage had to give up Sicily and pay a huge indemnity. You thought it was the end of it? Wasn't. The two sides continued to fight, this time on a much larger scale. The Second Punic War, which you may know by one name, Hannibal. If you thought crossing the Alps with an army was crazy, imagine doing it with war elephants. That's right, Hannibal the legendary Carthaginian, generally tens of thousands of soldiers, hundreds of cavalry, and some 37 elephants across the mountains into Roman territory. How many of the elephants survived is still debated, but one thing is certain. Hannibal sent Rome into a panic. Stand on the battlefield of Cannae, 216 BC, smoke and dust are billowing. Screams are echoing from every direction. The Romans are pinned down in a Carthaginian arc, and within hours, some 50,000 Romans have died, one of the most disastrous defeats in military history. Rome, once again, should have fallen. But it didn't. They didn't ask for peace. They didn't surrender. Instead, they continued to recruit, pay more taxes, and fight back in secret. The Romans seem to have a strange principle. Defeat is part of victory. The adage, Rome wasn't built in a day, may have come from that same spirit. While Hannibal was rampaging through Italy, a young general named Publius Cornelius Scipio decided to strike at Carthage's roots. Spain, then North Africa. Damned. And finally, at the Battle of Zama, Scipio defeated Hannibal. Carthage lost again, had to pay another indemnity, and this time was almost completely stripped of its military might. But the Romans did not forget. A generation later, they launched the Third Punic War, and this time, they wiped out Carthage completely. The city was razed to the ground, its people sold into slavery. Legend has it that the Romans sprinkled salt on the soil of Carthage so that nothing would grow there again, though modern historians say that detail may have been literary embellishment. Whatever the truth, you can't deny. Rome had paved the way to becoming the hegemon of the Mediterranean. But like every empire, each victory is a test of the inner self. You begin to see the subtle changes. Peasants losing their land to the great landowners. Slaves pouring in from conquered lands to replace the labor. Old soldiers returning home with nothing to live on. A society victorious but hollowing itself out. You pass by a slave market in Rome, where an old veteran stares at a group of men in chains. They plowed the land better than I did, he mutters, and I risked my life to bring them here. A rift begins. And from that rift, Roman history will begin to shake. You return to Rome, now in the 2nd century BC, and the city is unrecognizable. Its fair streets are packed with people, but not the placid Roman citizens you once knew, rather. Screaming, jostling crowds. Slaves doing hard labor and villas so magnificent, you have to squint against the glare of their white marble. Rome has won too much. Each military victory brings not just spoils, but thousands, even tens of thousands of slaves. Former peasants now have no land to farm, because the large estates latifunds are controlled by the elite use cheap slave labor. You meet a man named Marcus, a veteran of the Spanish campaign. He sits on the sidewalk, clutching a bottle of cheap wine, muttering, "I fought for the Republic. I have only the walls to lean on." Meanwhile, the Roman Senate, once the heart of the Republic, became mired in power struggles and factions. Wealthy politicians controlled everything from grain imports to who could vote. The common people, growing frustrated. One of the early responses came from two brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. Tiberius, the elder brother, proposed a law to redistribute public land to the poor. The idea was both revolutionary and very Roman. Land that had belonged to the state should be returned to the citizens. But the wealthy in the Senate did not like it. Tiberius was beaten to death in the Forum. Gaius, the younger brother, continued his reform. The result? Also killed. This time, hundreds of his supporters were massacred. Historians still debate whether the Gracchus brothers were true revolutionaries or merely tools in the political struggle. But the results were clear. The Republic was no longer strong. Political violence was now an acceptable tool. You get the feeling that Rome was becoming what it feared? A kingdom ruled by the strong. Meanwhile, a new name appeared. Gaius Marius. He changed the structure of the army, allowing the poor, those who did not own land, to join the army. In return, they were promised land after they left. Sound fair? Sure. But the problem was loyalty. These new soldiers were no longer loyal to the state, but to their commander, who had promised them a life after the war. And that was how Rome inadvertently created a private army, a kind of mercenary with an ideal, that sets the stage for the civil war that follows. Marius, then his rival, Sulla. And you stand by as Sulla, an unprecedented move, takes Rome. A Roman general takes the Roman capital, a sign that the so-called "no one is above the law" has officially cracked. Sulla assumes dictatorial power, then resigns. It seems he genuinely thought he would just do the necessary thing and go. But the door is open, and no one has forgotten. You can take Rome as long as you have enough troops. History repeats itself. A generation later, three new figures share power in an informal alliance: Julius Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus. Each has his own power, his own army, and his own ambitions. All is well, until Crassus dies on a disastrous campaign in the east and the alliance collapses. Pompey leans toward the Senate. Caesar was so famous, so successful in his conquest of Gaul, and then in 49 BC, Caesar did what no one else was allowed to do. He crossed the Rubicon River and led his army into Italy. The famous words "Alia iacta est." The die is cast may be ringing in your head, though historians still debate whether he actually said them. You stand in the square as Caesar returns to the city in the golden sunlight, not as a general, but as a king without a throne. Some people throw flowers, others retreat quietly into the alleys. Rome is no longer a republic, and it will be more than just political change. It will be permanent. You are standing in the shadow of the white columns of the Roman Forum, and there, in the midst of a hushed crowd, is Julius Caesar in his white toga, his head crowned with laurels, his scroll raised high. He has just been declared Dictator Perpetuo by the Senate, dictator for life, an honor or a warning. For men like Brutus or Cassius, it was a sign that the Republic was dead, and so they made plans. You can picture the scene in the Temple of Pompey on March 15, 44. BC, the Ides of March, when Caesar entered. No guards, just the men he had called his friends, and then the knives flashed. It is said that Caesar offered no resistance until he saw Brutus and exclaimed, "Et tu, Brute? You too, Brutus?" and then gave up. Whether historians are right or wrong, one thing is certain. Caesar's murder did not save the Republic. Instead, it threw Rome into chaos. You walk through a chaotic scene, the Roman people are angry. Crowds are screaming for justice for the father of the people, and the assassins have fled the city. Into this power vacuum, a young figure rises. Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and heir. Octavian, just 18 years old, allies himself with Mark Antony, Caesar's close general, and Lepidus, forming a second triumvirate. Their first goal? Hunt down Caesar's assassins. The Battle of Philippi was the end of the Republican dream. Brutus and Cassius both committed suicide, and the triumvirate, like all powerful alliances in history, it was short-lived. You see Octavian and Antony coming to blows. One is a cunning politician, the other a famous general and the lover of Cleopatra, the alluring and powerful queen of Egypt. Antony not only loves Cleopatra, but has children with her and is increasingly attached to the Eastern court. The Romans, who pride themselves on being a pragmatic, restrained people, view this with suspicion. Octavian cleverly uses all sorts of propaganda. Antony has betrayed Rome. He wants to crown a foreign queen. And so, war breaks out. You stand by the Gulf of Actium in 31 BC, where two giant fleets face off. Antony and Cleopatra lose the battle. A year later, they commit suicide in Egypt. Octavian becomes the sole ruler. But he does not repeat Caesar's mistake. There is no title of king. Instead, he carefully cultivated an image of a humble servant of the Republic, though in reality, he controlled everything. 27 BC, Octavian was given the title Augustus, meaning venerable, by the Senate, and so the Roman Empire was born. You step across the marble steps into a new Rome, where Augustus did the unexpected. Rebuild. Not just war, but infrastructure, laws, and a system of governance so durable that generations after him would imitate it. This was the Pax Romana, the Roman peace that lasted more than 2 centuries, an era when you could travel from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Syria, over the same Roman road network, using the same currency and under the same laws, an era when Romans could say with gentle confidence, "I am a Roman citizen." Yet beneath the surface of peace lie simmering challenges, rebellions in distant provinces, an increasing reliance on slaves, and successors who are not always worthy. Augustus had no sons. He was succeeded by his son-in-law, Tiberius. And so began the succession of emperors, some wise, some insane. You wonder, is Rome's stability real, or just a facade maintained by tight control? But before you can conclude, another portal opens where names like Caligula and Nero await you, with stories so incredible they will make you laugh while quietly. You enter the Palatine Hill, where the stories seem to have been written by playwrights rather than historians. The marble corridors, the gold-leafed domes, and the statues of the gods stare at you as if to warn you. Do not trust this peaceful facade. The man sitting on the throne is Tiberius, the second emperor of Rome, the successor to Augustus. Not a tyrant, but a cynical, reclusive, and distrustful one. You hear that he has retreated to the island of Capri to escape the chaos of politics, leaving power to his cruel courtier Sejanus. Tiberius is not mad, but he is old and tired. And then there is Caligula. His real name is Gaius, but he was called Caligula as a child, because he accompanied his father on military campaigns wearing small sandals callagae. Who would have thought that the little slipper would become the symbol of one of the most insane reigns in history? You watch Caligula in his early days, young, beloved, hopeful, but then, after a sudden illness, everything changes. It is said that he declared himself a living god, ordered a bridge to be built between 2 temples so he could ride across the divine sea. He had senators run around his table, appointed his horse Incitatus a priest, and once attempted to make him a consul. Although historians still debate the accuracy of these anecdotes, were they embellished by later generations? Caligula's death was real, assassinated by his guards in a palace corridor, his blood spilling onto the white marble. You are stunned, but the dynasty continues. He is succeeded by Claudius, an unlikely figure. Considered a fool because of his stutter and limp, Claudius was almost forgotten, until the Praetorian Guard pulled him out from behind the palace curtains and announced, "Here's the new emperor." And surprisingly, Claudius turned out to be smart, practical, and hard-working. He reformed the administration, expanded the empire, including invading Britannia. You can imagine Romans stomping through misty ground, planting eagles in lands that had never known a ruler. But the problems at court continued. Claudius married the ambitious Agrippina and adopted her illegitimate son, Nero. You never forget that name. Nero, the man who history has portrayed as a mad musician who burned Rome and played his lyre amid the flames. Though the truth may be different, many historians believe Nero was not in Rome when the fire broke out, that he organized the relief effort. The image is too powerful to be erased. You see a man who loved art but lacked leadership, a man who initially worked for the people but gradually fell into paranoia, a man who murdered his mother, murdered his wife, and eventually lost so much support that the Senate declared him an enemy of the state. Nero committed suicide, his last words reportedly being, "Qualis artifex perio." This is how an artist like me should die, and so the Julius Claudian dynasty ended. But Rome did not remain vacant for long. You entered the year 69 AD, the year of the 4 emperors. Galba, Otho, Vitellius, the rise and fall of one after another. Rome was in turmoil, the legions everywhere electing their own emperors. As they had in the days of Sulla and Caesar, but now in a national version. Finally, one man, one decisive support, Vespasian. He was not of the old aristocratic line, but a commoner who brought order after the storm. Under him and his two sons Titus and Domitian, the Flavian dynasty began. Titus, the eldest, reigned only briefly, but he inaugurated one of the greatest structures you have ever seen, the Colosseum. You stood beneath that great amphitheater, transfixed by the architecture, both breathtaking and slightly terrifying. It had once been the stage for deadly combat, where tens of thousands cheered whenever blood was spilled. Part of you wanted to leave. The other part was drawn in like every Roman who had ever sat on that cold stone bench. Titus died early, and Domitian ascended the throne. His reign was considered tyrannical, tightly controlled, but also effective in many ways. However, Domitian was eventually assassinated and erased from many official records. The Romans called it damnatio memoriae, erasure from collective memory. Now you begin to understand. An empire is not just about wars or architecture, but also about a series of ambitious, flawed, and hopeful people. Each emperor is a story, and each story sows the seeds for the future. You are about to enter the 2nd century, the golden age of the Roman Empire, where stability and glory reach their peak. But like all good dreams, they will eventually fade. You walk the cobblestone streets of Rome as the empire enters what later generations call its golden age, the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, a period of nearly 2 centuries without major civil war, during which Rome's economy is stable, its roads, law, and trade are at their peak. And at the head of this period is Nerva, who begins a series of emperors known as the 5 Good Emperors. Nerva, a cautious old man, reigns for only 2 years, but leaves a lasting legacy. He chooses his successor not by blood, but by talent. His chosen one is Trajan, a general from Spain, respected by his troops and loved by his people. You follow Trajan on his campaigns that extend the empire to its farthest reaches. In the east, he conquers Dacia, the land that is now Romania, brings back enough treasure to fund massive public works. He passed Trajan's Column, which recounts his victories in elaborate spiral reliefs, like a stone comic book. Trajan also established a welfare system for orphans and repaired roads and ports. Under him, Rome was not just a military empire, but a model administrative machine. People from Syria to Hispania could proudly call themselves Roman citizens. But then, as always, times changed. After Trajan's death, he was succeeded by Hadrian, whom you might call a strategic dreamer. Disliking open warfare, Hadrian withdrew from some of the more difficult territories, fortifying his borders rather than conquering them. You walk along the Western-style Great Wall, Hadrian's Wall in Britain, a 70-mile-long wall that separated Roman territory from the tribes to the north. Hadrian was fascinated by architecture, Greek culture, and philosophy. He built the Tivoli Palazzo Police Garden, modeled after the wonders of the world. You enter it and are struck by its man-made ponds, marble columns, and arches that curve like poetry in stone. When a Jewish revolt broke out in Judea, he put it down ruthlessly. Hundreds of thousands died, and Jerusalem was rebuilt as a whole new Roman city. It was a bloody episode, and scholars still debate whether it was a necessary response or a brutal crackdown. When Hadrian died, the empire was transformed. You meet Antoninus Pius, who ruled for more than 2 decades with little major upheaval. Under him, Rome was a steady machine, quietly running through the gentle winds of history. A ruler not noted for his military exploits, but memorable for his stability. If you're a fan of dreamless sleep, you'll thank Antoninus, and then Marcus Aurelius. He doesn't look like an emperor. He's thin, brooding, and he writes in a notebook. The philosopher, emperor, he fought on the northern frontier against the Germans, and wrote his famous meditation. Remember every morning that you will meet the boastful, the ungrateful, and the deceitful. Marcus is the ideal, the wise, unassuming, but dutiful king. Yet his life was tested by constant warfare and the Antonine Plague, probably smallpox, which killed millions, including his co-emperor Lucius Verus and many soldiers. You see the weariness in his eyes as he writes on cold nights in the trenches. Life is too short. Live as if you were already dead and were given a second chance. Then the moment you've been waiting for arrives. Marcus dies, and the throne is passed to his son Commodus. You sigh. history is the same. Commodus is like the breathless finale of a grand symphony. A lover of wrestling, a self-proclaimed Hercules reborn, he even orders Rome renamed Colonia Commodiana. You feel like you're watching a parody of official history. Brutal, wasteful, and increasingly out of control, Commodus wears down the Senate and the army. He is finally assassinated while bathing by a gladiator. After that, Rome spirals into chaos again. You find yourself in the midst of a political storm as 193 AD becomes the year of the 5 emperors. From Pertinax to Didius Julianus, who bought the throne at Auxin, to Septimius Severus, an African general from Leptis Magna, you see the empire changing. Though still vast, Rome is no longer the sole center. Emperors can come from all over the country, and the provincial legions now have a stronger voice than the Senate. Under Severus, the power of the army reaches its peak, and you realize the empire built on the sword is now dependent on itself. The cracks are starting to show. But as the Romans once believed, Roma invicta, Rome never loses. You know that is about to be tested. A new chapter, darker, more chaotic, is unfolding. You walk through the crumbling walls of a colossal empire. Rome didn't fall in a day, and in the 3rd century, you start to hear the cracks, a clanking of chains in civil war. The trumpets of approaching foreign armies, the clanking of silver coins. This is what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century. And it's not just one crisis, it's an endless series of crises. You enter a period of chaos so great that you've had 26 emperors in less than 50 years. The Romans even nicknamed them soldier emperors. See each one ascend to the throne as a general: Gallienus, Claudius Gothicus, Aurelian. One is assassinated at a banquet, another dies on the march, another is betrayed by his own soldiers. The empire is like a chariot with 10 men fighting for the reins, and all are pulling in different directions. But it wasn't just civil war. On the frontiers, foreign powers were pressing harder. The Goths invaded the Balkans from the north. The Sassanid Persians pressed in on Syria from the east. In a major shock, Emperor Valerian, a tough, battle-hardened old man, was captured by the Persians in 260. And you read that right? He was turned into a footstool for the Persian king to mount his horse. Scholars still debate why the empire didn't collapse right away. Some say the administrative structure was still too strong. Others believe the loyalty of the provinces was still enough to keep it together. Whatever the reason, one thing is certain: Rome had lost its luster. Yet amid the ashes, there was a silver lining. You meet Aurelian, one of those rare emperors who was truly talented and had a will of steel. Within 5 years, he crushed the rebels, recaptured the eastern provinces controlled by Queen Zenobia of Palmyra, and conquered Gaul, where the generals had declared themselves emperors. Zenobia, by the way, is one of the most interesting mythological figures of the period. Beautiful, intelligent, educated in Greek, and fluent in Egyptian, she once considered herself a descendant of Cleopatra. And you can imagine a battle not just of swords, but of Zenobia against Aurelian, as the two symbols of East and West. Aurelian also built a formidable wall around Rome. The Aurelian Wall can still be seen today. You stand on one of the watchtowers and hear him whisper in the wind. Rome is no longer an impregnable center. It is time for us to defend ourselves like ordinary people. You sense a profound change. Rome is no longer the one who always expands, but begins to shrink, and defend. After Aurelian, there was still a lot of turmoil. Toward the end of the century, a figure stepped onto the scene and changed everything: Ecclesian. You see him as a giant administrator, strict, organized, almost the CEO of a corporation on the brink of bankruptcy. And he began with a radical change, dividing the empire into 2 parts, East and West. Not divide and conquer, but divide and survive. He established a model called the Tetrarchy: 2 Augusti and 2 Caesars, each ruling a region. The idea was to have a clear successor, avoiding civil war. On paper, smart. But in practice, you guessed it, people. Diocletian also instituted drastic economic reforms: price controls, a new currency, and a reorganization of the army and administration. He lived in seclusion in the Diocletian Palace in Split, far from the crowds, leading many to call him the Divine Emperor, Dominus et Deus, or God and the Gods. And then you see the unprecedented. He abdicated in 305. Not assassinated, not forced, just retired, planted cabbages. Scholars still debate whether this was a wise decision or a mistake that led to the subsequent collapse of the system he created. You see the Tetrarchy disintegrate almost immediately, as the Caesars and Augusti fought for power. And from that rubble a name begins to shine like the sun rising in the east: Constantine. History is about to turn again, this time permanently. You sit on a rock by the roadside, as the sound of horses' hooves echoes in the distance. An army is approaching, its banners fluttering in the wind. But there's something different. Instead of the traditional symbols of the Roman gods, you see a cross, and the rider at the head, in gleaming armor, is Constantine, the man who would change Rome forever. Constantine was more than just a general. He was a skilled politician, a tenacious strategist, and the first to realize that a crumbling empire could be held together by something that transcended race, language, and geography. Religion. You're transported back to the year 312, before the famous Battle of Milvian Bridge. When Constantine faced Maxentius, one of the great rivals for the throne of the Western Empire, legend has it that the night before the battle, Constantine looked up at the sky and saw a sign. In hoc signo vinces, with this sign, you will conquer. That sign, a cross, the symbol of Christianity. Modern historians still fiercely debate whether this was real, a vision, a political strategy, or just... But you can't deny that after his victory, Constantine openly supported Christianity, first with the Edict of Milan in 313, which legalized the religion, and then gradually made it the new soul of the empire. You wander through the first churches in Rome, built under Constantine, St. Peter's, the Lateran. No longer having to gather secretly in the catacombs, Christians now traveled freely, preached openly, and even had the support of the imperial court. Constantine didn't stop there, but he continued to move the heart of the empire. You stand on an ancient harbor in Byzantium, small Greek city on the Bosphorus. And here, Constantine built a new capital, Constantinople, the city of Constantine. The new city was a curious blend of Roman tradition, Greek spirit, and Christian faith. You walked along cobblestoned avenues, heard church bells ringing beside imperial columns, and saw bronze-armored guards standing next to robed priests. Constantinople was more than a city. It was a statement that Rome had been transformed. From an empire that conquered with swords, it was now an empire united by new beliefs, institutions, and symbols. But the change was not without cost. You watched the ancient world crumble layer by layer. Ancient temples were abandoned, traditional rituals disappeared, and the confrontation between Christians and pagans intensified. In 391, Emperor Theodosius officially banned all pagan rituals, a 1,000-year-old end to traditional Roman religion. You see many people at the time feeling confused, as if the foundations of their culture were being upended. If the gods have abandoned us, is disaster approaching? An old priest whispers over a flickering oil lamp. Not long after Constantine, the empire fell into disarray. Theodosius was the last emperor to rule both East and West. After him, the two halves split permanently. You look to the west and see strange signs. The treasury is empty. The army is largely mercenary, and the border provinces are losing control. Meanwhile, in the east, Constantinople is still thriving, standing like a fortress in a storm. And then, like an omen, you hear the pounding of horses. The Huns from the east are pouring into Europe, pushing a host of Germanic peoples like Goths, Vandals, Franks, and more into Roman territory. These are no longer isolated incursions. They are massive waves of migration. Scholars still debate whether it is climate change, pressure from the Central Asian steppes, or Rome's weakness to defend its borders. Whatever the reason, you see the cities along the Rhine and Danube begin to fall into ruin, and barbarian peoples settled deep within the Roman heartland. And then, in 410, the unthinkable happens. Alaric and the Visigoths sack Rome. You stand amid the ruins, and you feel fear and confusion spread across Europe. The once invincible empire is now crumbling right in your own heart. You recall the words of a citizen of the time. When Rome falls, what is eternal? You stand on an ancient cobblestone street now cracked, with weeds creeping between the bricks once laid by the hands of master Roman engineers. The air is strangely quiet, and Rome, the immortal city, looks less like a center of power than a silent shadow of itself. After the sack of Rome in 410 by the Visigoths, Rome has never been the true capital of the ancient world. You hear the people whispering about the end, but the empire endures at least in form. Emperors are still crowned, laws are still made, but real power is slipping through their fingers like sand. You watch the tide of power flow toward the military leaders, many of them non-Roman. One such figure is Stilicho, a Vandal general who tried to defend Rome but was eventually executed by his own court for being too powerful. Then there is Flavius Idius, the last of the Romans, who defeated Attila the Hun at the Battle of Chalons in 451. But even he was assassinated by Emperor Valentinian III a few years later. You see a tragic cycle. Those strong enough to save the empire are often distrusted, eliminated, and then the empire is weakened even more. And then, as if by a cruel twist of fate, Rome is sacked again in 455, this time by the Vandals. From then on, vandalism, the practice of vandalism, became a word associated with them. You walk past decapitated statues, defaced frescoes, and understand that the memory of Rome's greatness is being erased bit by bit. But the story is not over. You are transported to Ravenna, a small city in northern Italy where the Western Roman Empire was founded in the 5th century. Ravenna, with its magnificent churches covered in gold and blue mosaics, is now a place where the last emperors live as puppets under the control of their generals. In 476, you witness what is considered the end of the Western Roman Empire. Odoacer, a Germanic leader, overthrows the young emperor Romulus Augustulus, who is only about 14 years old. He doesn't kill Romulus. He simply sends him off to live peacefully in a small villa with a pension. Strangely, the fall comes without fanfare. There are no screaming crowds, no historic announcements, just a slide that has come to an end. You imagine yourself as a commoner of the time. You have no idea that history has turned a page. You only notice that the guards no longer speak Latin, but German. The coins changed shape, taxes were still collected, markets were still held, bread was still sold. Of course, the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, survived. You hear the wind blowing from Constantinople, where Emperor Zeno still sits on the throne, receiving letters from Odoacer. One empire died, but the other lived on for nearly another millennium. Yet the East-West divide made you feel a permanent rift. Languages began to diverge. Latin gave way to Greek in the East. The church began to divide. Culture, law, aesthetics, all gradually drifted apart, like two rivers branching from the same source but never meeting again. Modern historians still disagree on the year of the fall of Rome. Some say 476, others point to 410, or even later. The 6th century, when Italy was contested by the Eastern Romans and the Goths. Some say Rome never really fell, it just morphed. It's adapted and left its mark on every language, every street, every institution of the modern West. You sit on a step in Ravenna, watching the afternoon light wash the mosaic dome of the Basilica of San Vitale in gold. Images of Christ are resplendent, surrounded by saints, emperors, and princesses, an empire thoroughly Christianized. The question that rings in your mind is no longer, when did Rome fall, but what became of Rome afterward? You look up at the sky over Ravenna, the twilight fading. In the pale gray of the late twilight, bells ring from a nearby church, a distant echo of an empire that never really died. Rome has fallen on paper, yes. In real life, Rome has begun to branch out. You leave Ravenna, following caravans through the Italian countryside, and begin to realize that while the empire is no longer a unified entity, its traces are everywhere. You stop by a monastery at Monte Cassino, where Benedictine monks copy ancient Roman manuscripts line by line. It is here that classical culture has survived the Dark Ages. It is a sweet paradox. While the castles and temples have fallen, the Roman idea has survived. On paper, and it is the monks, the ones who do not carry swords and spears, who have kept the Roman spirit alive longer than any army. You pass by a court in the 6th century, during the time of the Ostrogothic kingdom. The judge reads the law. In Latin, the language of the empire was not forgotten, but became the standard. Words like senatus, civitas, imperium remain. The entire Western legal system, from Roman civil code to Napoleonic law, was deeply influenced by what Roman lawyers had written centuries earlier. You continue your journey to Gaul, now France. The Franks occupied the area, but they still built Roman-style walls, set up Roman markets, and levied Roman taxes. Even Clovis, the first king to unite the Franks, converted to Catholicism. The Roman Church remained the legitimizing authority. In England, you see stone walls built by the Romans that now form the foundations of medieval monasteries. In Spain, mosques are built on the foundations of ancient Roman churches. In North Africa, triumphal arches, mosaics, and public baths lie quietly in the sand. The empire is gone, but it is not gone. One day you arrive in Constantinople. Although geographically far from Rome, this is where the Roman spirit has lingered the longest. During the reign of Justinian I, you witness a spectacular attempt to revive the Roman Empire. This time from the east, Justinian wanted not only to unify the territory, but also to restructure the entire legal system. The famous Corpus Juris Civilis was born, a spiritual copy of Roman law, refined and edited. You entered the Hagia Sophia, the largest church in the world at the time. It was the pinnacle of Byzantine architectural engineering. But if you look closely, you can still see the Roman spirit in every arch, every semicircular tower, every symmetrical stone column. Under Justinian, the Eastern Roman army regained much of its former territory, North Africa, Italy, and parts of Spain. But the victory was short-lived. War, disease, and local resistance meant that the restored empire did not last long. But Justinian's efforts showed that the Roman spirit was alive and not easily forgotten. You leave Constantinople as the morning sun hits the waters of the Sea of Marmara. Your boat takes you west, where hundreds of years later, another Roman revival will take place, this time led by the Pope and Charlemagne. In 800, Charlemagne is crowned Holy Roman Emperor, marking the rebirth of the Roman Empire in Western Europe, albeit a very different Rome, one steeped in Christianity and Germanic culture. But the title Roman Emperor remains, though it is more a political memory than an actual power. You realize people never stopped dreaming about Rome. Empires, dynasties, cities, all wanted to attach themselves to that name. From the German Empire, the Russian Tsar, to even Mussolini later, everyone wanted to restore the glory of Rome. And that is what made Rome immortal. You stand before the ruins of Palatine Hill, once the site of the Roman imperial palaces. On its ancient surface, you can imagine lavish banquets, state meetings, zithers playing under oil lamps, and togas fluttering across marble corridors. Now, only weeds and a few stray cats doze in the sun. It's strange, you think, that an empire that once ruled the world should be so quiet, but then you realize that silence is part of existence. The Roman Empire is gone, but it never completely disappeared. It has melted away, seeping into the soil, the language, the social system you still live in. Instead of a living organism, it has become an underground stream. You arrive in Florence, 14th century. A new wave is rising, the Renaissance. And guess what the Florentine thinkers were reading? The works of Cicero, Seneca, Ovid, Virgil. Roman works that had been forgotten in the darkness of the Middle Ages were now sought after by scholars like Gold. Florentines, Venetians, Genoese began to learn ancient Latin, began to build houses in the Roman style, dressed like those in ancient paintings, and most of all, began to think like citizens of the Republic. He stopped by Raphael's studio, where he recreated the dome of the Pantheon in a painting. And Michelangelo, when designing the dome of St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican, chose proportions inspired by Roman structures. Even Leonardo da Vinci drew Roman engineering devices admiringly. Rome was resurrected, not with swords, but with brushes and knowledge. In the north, you saw Gutenberg invent the printing press in the first printed book, a work in Latin. Across Europe, translations of Tacitus, Livy, Caesar, etc. were printed and distributed. People didn't just remember Rome, they began to dream of becoming Rome again. You move on to the 18th century. In Paris, Rousseau talked about the ideal republic, an idea that had its roots in the Roman Republic. In America, founding fathers like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison quoted Cato and Cicero as much as they quoted the Bible. Washington, D.C. was laid out with Corinthian columns, cupolas, and pediments, true Roman style. Even the Senate, Congress, and the term republic were products of the Roman legacy. In many political debates, American scholars of the time would ask, "What would you have done if you were Cincinnatus, Caesar, or Augustus?" You let out a chuckle. An empire that had died in chaos had become the model of modern democracy. History doesn't go straight, you think. It slips, twists, and then comes back to where it started, but in a new form. In the 20th century, you stop in Italy. A figure named Benito Mussolini stands before the crowd and shouts, "We will restore the Roman Empire." Ancient ruins are unearthed at his feet. The Via dei Fori Imperiali is paved straight through the ancient Roman area. This time, however, Rome is not portrayed in ideals but in propaganda. Mussolini tries to create a cinematic version of the ancient world, full of grandeur, but empty. A Rome without philosophy, without a republic, only power. You leave Italy, entering modern times. From Hollywood to textbooks, the image of Rome is still present. Warriors in shiny armor, bloody arenas, emperors with laurel wreaths. But it's just a mask. The real Rome, the enduring, profound Rome, is not in action movies, but in the way people build laws, organize societies, and imagine power. You think of Julius Caesar, who said Veni Vidi, Vici. But you think to yourself, Rome didn't just conquer with armies, conquered with ideas. And those ideas, thousands of years later, still resonate in your mind. You walk along the cobblestones of the Via Appia Antiquata, ancient Roman road that led south from the heart of Rome. Each stone seems to echo with the footsteps of thousands of soldiers. And even camels carrying goods from as far away as Asia Minor, an empire in decline. But its roads still breathe, still carry memories. You bend down, pick up a small pebble, and think to yourself, they held together a world with nothing but stones and will. From Britain to Syria, from the Danube to the Sahara, the Roman system of roads, bridges, irrigation, law, and administration formed the backbone of a network that no previous civilization had ever created. But what surprises you most is not the roads, it is their ability to continue to be used thousands of years after their owners disappeared. You recall a quote from a history professor. The Roman Empire did not collapse. It dispersed and then permeated every culture that passed through it. Now you are in London, a modern city with subways and skyscrapers, but beneath the modernity, you find the foundations of Londinium, a Roman trading city that once thrived with wine, olive oil, and slaves from the Mediterranean. The stone walls, the aqueduct, even the broken pottery, are still there in the heart of the British capital. You continue on to Cologne, once Colonia Claudia era Agrippinensium. The city was founded by the Romans and still retains much of its original name. Every stone, every bridge, every section of the citadel, you can trace the Romans. And in each of these places you find a story. A retired general opens a tavern. An engineer builds a stone bridge across a river. A Gallic family switches to Latin because it's easier to trade. The so-called fall of Rome turns out to be just a subtle redistribution. In the Balkans, the vernacular languages still have traces of Latin. In Western Europe, the system of measurements, civil law, even the writing system, still reflects Roman logic. And above all, Roman law is still cited when arguing about human rights in international courts. You stop in Jerusalem. Under layers of archaeology, Roman structures are discovered beneath churches, synagogues, and Muslim holy sites. And the irony is, the same empire that persecuted Jews and Christians inadvertently created the conditions for those religions to spread through its road system and urbanization. Christianity, you think, rose with the unwitting support of the pagan empire that once tried to crush it, and as it grew, it resurrected Roman symbols. Popes wore long robes, called themselves Pontifex Maximus, a title once reserved for emperors. Churches had domes, thrones, and even canon law, inspired by Roman legal texts. You mutter to yourself, they didn't abolish Rome. They incorporated it into us. From churches to parliaments, from cities to languages, You begin to see that Rome is more than a museum. It lives on in every behavior, every organization, every idea you consider normal. You return to Rome. It's still Rome, but it's no longer the all-powerful, eternal city. It's now a city of tourism, pizza, Vespas, and fountains. But one evening, as you sit on the steps of Piazza Venezia, watching the sunlight slide through the dome, you sense something clearly. The Roman Empire is gone, but it is not dead. It has been shattered into many forms: English, French, German, Italian, Spanish, all carrying within them a part of that legacy. Even the way you think, so-called Western civilization, is a lingering whisper from the lecture halls of Cicero and the forums of Augustus. You close your eyes. There is the soft cooing of doves. There is the distant sound of church bells. And perhaps somewhere in the wind, you hear the creaking of carriages on cobblestones, a distant echo of a past that has never disappeared. You wake up in the soft light of a misty morning in Constantinople, or rather modern-day Istanbul, but there's no mistaking it, even though the signs have been changed to Turkish. And the Hagia Sophia is now a museum. The tiles, the mosaics, and the soaring vaults still tell the story of a second Rome. Yes, Rome fell in the west in 476. But in the east it lived on for nearly another millennium under the name Byzantium. You step through the Theodosian Gate and feel as if you've traveled back to the 6th century. The city was a center of power, learning, and religion. It had baths, water wheels, a hippodrome, and a repository of thousands of precious manuscripts, the kind of stuff Western Europe was still trying to piece together from the ashes of Rome. The Byzantines not only preserved but also developed much of the Roman legacy. Law was codified in the Justinian Code. Architecture was elevated to the level of the magnificent Hagia Sophia, and art developed an aesthetic that was reminiscent of angels flying in gold leaf. You enter an ancient church. On the vaulted ceiling, eyeless angels look down at you as if to say, "We are the deified part of Rome." In the east, Rome did not decline because of the barbarians from the north, but because of religious wars, the rise of Islam, and the long struggle for power between king and church. You sit in a cafe on the shores of the Sea of Marmara, sipping Turkish coffee, and rereading the last part of Eastern Rome. Yet the Roman legacy did not disappear. The Ottomans still used the old Roman infrastructure, the Byzantine libraries, and even the mathematicians, engineers, and doctors who had been trained in the Greco-Roman style. You recall an interesting fact. The word Caesar, the title of the supreme emperor of Rome, had morphed into Kaiser in Germany and Tsar in Russia. Even those who were no longer Roman citizens wanted to inherit that aura. Once again, you see clearly that Rome did not die. It transformed, silently, patiently, like an underground river. You continue your journey to Moscow. Here in the 15th century, an idea blossomed. Moscow is the third Rome. The first Rome had collapsed, Constantinople. The second Rome had fallen. And so Orthodox Russia would be the keeper of the last flame of Rome and primitive Christianity. A holy ambition, wrapped in the imperial robes. You visit the Kremlin. There, amid the onion domes and red walls, you can help but sense the echoes of power that Caesar or Augustus would have nodded in approval of. The ceremonies, the imperial statutes, the court dress, all are tinged with Roman, albeit through a Slavic veneer. And once again you realize, Rome is more than an empire. It is a reference, symbol of ultimate power that every dynasty after it is sought to embody. Even the United States, halfway around the world, once a colony of the British Empire, drew heavily on the Roman Republican model when it was founded. From the Senate to the double-headed eagle, from the Latin phrase e pluribus unum to the Pantheon-style Capitol, Americans have reimagined the Roman dream in a new light. You walk through Washington, D.C., looking at the white columns, the high domes, and the open plazas, and hear a faint echo of ancient Rome. We're not really gone, we're just changing roles. And then you smile, realizing that where there is law, where there is a dream of justice, where there is order and chaos, there is still Rome. You were sitting by a small stream in southern France province, once the Gallia Narbonensis of the Roman Empire. The rolling hills are lavender, insects are chirping, and in the distance, the gray stone walls of an ancient Roman theater. You think about all that Rome left behind. Not just monuments, roads, or public buildings, but a kind of logic, a way of thinking, implicit measure of civilization. A measure that the modern world sometimes applies, without realizing that it is walking on foundations laid more than 2,000 years ago. The Romans conquered a vast world, but the strange thing is, what made them immortal was not conquest. It was the ability to unite. You remember the concept of Roman citizen? A title that, over time, was no longer reserved for Italians, but was given to Gauls, Thracians, North Africans, even former enemies. And yes, there was a black Roman emperor named Septimius Severus from Libya, a barbarian emperor named Maximinus Thrax from a remote area, and a philosopher, emperor named Marcus Aurelius, who spent his life asking himself, am I living right, rather than am I winning? You wonder, this is why Rome has endured so long, because they didn't just rule, they learned, absorbed, and passed it on. A Gaul could become a senator, a Greek could write a history for the court, a Syrian could design the public baths at Pompeii. And even when there were revolts, wars, rebellions, the system still managed to restore balance. Like a river that has been blocked but then flows away, continuing to flow. You look at the horizon, there is the sound of church bells. There is the smell of baked bread from a small shop near the square. People on bicycles, wearing light jackets, calling to each other in soft French accents that contain thousands of years of overlapping cultures. You realize they live on Roman soil, but they don't need to know it, because Rome has permeated the land, the water, the people. It no longer needs symbols. It just needs to live with the flow. You return to something that historians still argue about. Did the Roman Empire collapse in the 5th century? Or did it simply transform into new entities? The question has no definite answer. Some believe that Rome collapsed because of internal corruption, and division between rich and poor. Others believe that it was its tolerance, its over-openness to foreigners that caused it to lose its identity. And then there are those who believe that Rome has simply reached the end of a cycle too great to sustain itself. You don't choose a side. You just sit there listening to the wind through the arches, watching the golden sunlight paint patterns on the old stone. And you wonder, if Rome were still here today, would you be sitting here? Free, carefree, and dreaming? Maybe not. Maybe the best thing Rome ever did was let itself dissolve, gracefully, slowly, and infectiously. So you stand up, fold up the map, and walk out into the street. Joining the people who happen to be walking on the sidewalks where an ancient Roman road used to be. You don't need any signs, because like the greatest empires, Rome is no longer a place. It's a feeling that everything, even the greatest, will pass away, but the echoes remain. Gentle, persistent, immortal, and now, with the story closed, you can relax. Gentle as marble statues in the evening light, as the Pantheon dome catches the morning sun, as clogs clatter in the ancient square. Rome rose, then fell, then melted into the wind, but it never disappeared. You live in it every day, in its language, in its laws, in its dreams of reaching out, and in its desire to build something more lasting than yourself. Imagine yourself floating gently down the Tiber River as the mist lingers around the ancient walls. No cars, no history, just your breath and a civilization lulling you to sleep. Gentle, no conquest, no crown. Rome is coaxing you, not in splendor, but in the silent presence, in every old brick, every gentle breeze, every gentle sleep. And if you can feel that, you have truly entered Rome. Good night.